The thermometer outside Mikael Virtanen's cabin read negative 37 degrees, and inside his family huddled around a roaring fire that barely kept frost from forming on the interior walls. 200 yards away, Cornelis van der Meer walked barefoot across his warm stone floor and watched his Finnish neighbor carry another armload of wood into a cabin that would never be warm enough. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The cold had lasted 12 days without mercy. Across the scattered settlements of Minnesota Territory in January 1842, trappers and their families fought a losing battle against temperatures that seemed determined to kill everything that breathed. Mikael Virtanen stood inside his log cabin feeding wood into a fire that consumed fuel with desperate hunger but produced warmth that fled through every gap and crack in the walls. His wife, wrapped in 3 blankets, sat close enough to the flames that her face flushed red, while her back remained so cold she could see her breath. Their 2 children slept in a pile of furs on the floor, positioned as near to the fireplace as safety allowed, and still they shivered through their dreams. Mikael had fed that fire every 2 hours for 12 straight days. The stack of split wood outside his door, which should have lasted until March, had shrunk to a pile that might carry them another 3 weeks if they were lucky. The interior temperature, measured by a thermometer hanging on the wall farthest from the fire, read 53 degrees. Frost formed at the corners where the cold seeped through the gaps in the chinking. The dirt floor was frozen solid. Every breath hung visible in the air. This was survival, not comfort, and Mikael was losing. He carried another armload of wood inside, kicked the door shut against the wind, and happened to glance toward the hillside 200 yards to the east. Cornelis van der Meer's cabin sat there, half buried in the earth like something between a house and a cave. Mikael had thought the structure absurd when Cornelis built it 18 months earlier. The Dutchman had spent 11 weeks digging and hauling stone and packing earth against logs when any sensible man could build a perfectly adequate cabin in 4 days. The result looked like a badger hole with windows. The community had made jokes about it for months. But smoke rose from Cornelis's chimney now in a thin, lazy stream, nothing like the desperate column pouring from Mikael's own roof. And through those windows, visible even at this distance in the late afternoon gloom, golden light glowed with a steadiness that suggested comfort rather than survival. Mikael's wife had mentioned something strange 2 days earlier when she had walked past Cornelis's cabin on her way to check their snares. Small patches of grass were growing green at the foundation, she had said, right up against the front wall where snow should have been piled deep. Mikael had dismissed it as southern exposure or some trick of drainage. Now, watching that thin stream of smoke and that steady golden light while his own fire devoured wood and barely kept his family from freezing, Mikael wondered if perhaps the Dutchman had understood something the rest of them had missed. 3 years earlier, in April 1839, Cornelis van der Meer had arrived in Minnesota Territory with a trapping partner named Jacob Kowalski. They had met in St. Louis during the spring rendezvous, discovered they both planned to work the tributaries north of Fort Snelling, and decided partnership made more sense than competing for the same beaver streams. Jakub was Polish, spoke broken English, and had trapped for 2 seasons in the Wisconsin Territory. Cornelis was Dutch, raised in a brick mason's household in the Netherlands before immigrating at age 19, and this would be his first season in the true wilderness. They selected a site along a creek that fed into the Minnesota River, surrounded by beaver sign and far enough from established camps to avoid territorial disputes. The location was ideal for trapping, but offered nothing else remarkable. Rolling hills covered in oak and pine, water access, decent drainage. They built their cabin in 4 days using standard methods. Logs cut from nearby trees, notched at the corners, stacked with moss and mud packed between gaps. A single door facing south, One small window covered with oiled paper, a dirt floor, a simple stone ring for fire in the center of the single room. The structure measured 12 feet by 14 feet and would keep out rain and wind. That was sufficient. They established their trap lines, worked through spring and summer, and built a modest collection of pelts. Jacob was competent and steady. Cornelis learned quickly. They worked well together, speaking little, but developing the efficient rhythm that successful partnerships require. By October, they had enough furs to make the season profitable. They discussed whether to make the journey to St. Louis to sell before winter or wait until spring. Jacob argued for waiting. The weather was turning and the trail would be difficult. Better to trap through winter and sell a larger load in spring. Cornelis agreed. November arrived with unusual cold. Most years, the deep freeze held off until late December, giving trappers time to prepare. But in 1839, the temperature dropped early and dropped hard. By mid-November, they were experiencing nights in the teens, and by late November, the thermometer read single digits at dawn. They adjusted their routine, checking traps closer to camp and making sure to return before dark. The cabin was adequate, but not comfortable. They kept a fire burning continuously, which meant one of them woke every few hours through the night to add wood. On November 23rd, Jacob set out alone to check the northern trap line. Cornelis stayed at camp to process 3 beaver pelts they had brought in the previous day. The work was tedious and required good light, so Cornelis positioned himself near the window and worked steadily through the morning. Around midday, the wind picked up. By early afternoon, snow began falling. Cornelis expected Jacob back by 3. When 4 o'clock arrived and darkness was gathering, he started to worry. By 5, he had made his decision and set out to find his partner. Cornelis found Jacob 2 miles north of camp, near the beaver dam where their northernmost trap was set. His partner lay curled on his side beneath a pine tree, his rifle across his lap, his pack still on his back. Snow had begun to cover him. Cornelis knew before he touched the body that Jacob was dead. The cold had accomplished what bears and hostile encounters and all the other dangers of frontier life had failed to do. It had simply waited until a man was alone and vulnerable, then killed him with patient efficiency. Reconstructing what happened was straightforward. The trap had caught a beaver. Jacob had reset it, packed the beaver, and started back toward camp. The temperature had dropped rapidly as the storm moved in. Jacob had been dressed for cold, but not for the bitter wind that accompanied the snow. At some point he had realized he was in trouble. He had stopped, attempted to build a fire. The evidence was there in the scattered kindling and the char marks on bark he had stripped from the pine. But his hands had been too cold, or the wind too strong, or the kindling too damp. The fire had not caught. Jacob had made the rational decision to keep moving toward camp. But 2 miles in deep, cold, with wind stealing heat from exposed skin, was too far. He had stopped again, this time not by choice, but because his body had simply stopped cooperating. He had curled against the base of the tree, likely thinking he would rest for a few minutes and then continue. But hypothermia does not wait. It shuts down the body systematically, starting at the extremities and working inward. Jacob had fallen asleep and never woken. Cornelis carried his partner's body back to camp through the gathering darkness. The storm intensified. By the time he reached the cabin, snow was falling so heavily he could barely see 10 feet ahead. He laid Jacob's body in the small shed they used for storing furs and equipment. The ground was frozen too hard for burial. That would have to wait for morning. Inside the cabin, Cornelis built up the fire and sat staring at the flames. The reality that had always been abstract became concrete in those hours. Men died in the wilderness. He had known this intellectually, but knowing and understanding were different things. Jacob had been competent and careful. He had made no obvious mistakes. He had simply been caught out when the temperature dropped and the wind rose, and that combination had killed him as surely as a rifle shot. Cornelis did not sleep that night. He fed the fire and thought about the cabin around him. The structure that had seemed adequate suddenly appeared fragile. Heat fled through the gaps between logs. The dirt floor conducted cold upward from the frozen earth below. The single room felt exposed and vulnerable. If the fire went out, the interior temperature would drop to match the exterior within hours. A man alone in this cabin during a storm would freeze to death. Morning arrived gray and bitter. The storm had passed, leaving 8 inches of new snow and temperatures in the single digits. Cornelis prepared Jakob's body for burial, wrapping it in their spare canvas tarp and securing it with rope. He selected a spot on the hillside overlooking the creek, a place where the view extended across the valley they had trapped together. The ground resisted his shovel. Frozen earth does not yield easily. It took him 4 hours to dig a grave deep enough to protect the body from scavengers. He buried Jakub Kowalski without ceremony. There was no one to speak words over the grave, and Cornelis was not a religious man. He piled stones over the disturbed earth, marked the site with a wooden cross fashioned from 2 pine branches lashed together, and returned to the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. The cabin felt different now. What had been a simple shelter became a structure he examined with new awareness. Every gap between logs represented heat loss. Every crack in the chinking was a pathway for cold to enter. The dirt floor was a thermal drain, pulling warmth downward into frozen earth. The single room offered no protection if the fire failed. A man could die here as easily as Jakub had died beneath that pine tree, just more slowly, and with the illusion of safety. Cornelis spent the evening calculating. He had no formal education in mathematics or engineering, but his father had taught him practical geometry and measurement for masonry work. He estimated the cabin's interior volume, the surface area of walls and roof and floor. He considered heat loss through each surface. A fire in the center of the room radiated heat in all directions, but most of that heat escaped. It rose to the roof where it conducted through wood and shingles into the cold air above. It spread to walls where it passed through logs and gaps into the exterior. It sank into the dirt floor where frozen earth absorbed it endlessly. The mathematics were brutal. For every measure of heat the fire produced, perhaps 1 measure in 10 remained in the cabin long enough to warm the air people breathed. The other 9 measures fled through the 6 surfaces that enclosed the space. Walls, floor, and roof all betrayed the fire's effort equally. To maintain livable temperature required constant fuel consumption, and even then the interior barely achieved comfort. In extreme cold, the battle was lost before it began. Other trappers accepted this reality as unchangeable. Cabins were cold. Winter was hard. Men who could not endure did not survive. But Cornelis had watched his partner die because shelter had failed, and acceptance felt like surrender. There had to be a better approach. Cornelis spent the remainder of that winter alone in the cabin, trapping enough to justify the season, but primarily thinking about the problem of heat. Every morning he woke to a cabin that had lost 20 degrees overnight, despite banked coals in the fire pit. Every evening he calculated how much wood he burned compared to the warmth he achieved. The mathematics never improved. For every cord of wood consumed, the cabin provided barely enough heat to sustain life during the coldest months. He began visiting other trappers' camps within a day's travel, claiming he needed to trade supplies or share information about trap lines. In truth, he was studying their cabins. He examined construction methods, noting how different men approached the same basic problem. Some used larger logs, thinking thickness would provide better insulation. Others chinked more carefully, trying to eliminate gaps. A few built double walls with airspace between, attempting to create a buffer against the cold. None of these approaches solved the fundamental issue. All cabins lost heat through 6 surfaces equally, and all required constant fire tending to remain habitable. One trapper named Peter Halverson had built his cabin partially into a hillside, backing it against a natural earth embankment to reduce wind exposure. Cornelis spent an afternoon examining that structure, asking questions that Peter found odd. How did the earth-backed wall compare to the exposed walls? Did moisture from the ground create problems? Did the earth feel cold against the interior? Peter answered patiently, but clearly thought the question strange. The earth backing helped with wind, he said, but the wall still needed the same chinking and care as any other. The earth did not make things warmer, it just made things less cold, which was not the same thing. But Cornelis noticed something Peter had not articulated. The earth-backed wall had no frost forming on its interior surface, while the three exposed walls showed frost in the corners every morning. That single observation suggested the earth was doing more than simply blocking wind. It was maintaining the wall at a different temperature than the exposed walls achieved. Cornelis returned to his own cabin and began a series of simple experiments. He dug into the frozen ground outside, measuring how deep he needed to go before the earth was no longer frozen. At 18 inches, the ground remained hard. At 30 inches, it began to soften. At 48 inches, the earth was cold, but not frozen, maintaining a temperature that his hands could tolerate for several seconds. He had discovered the frost line, though he did not know the term. Below that depth, earth remained above freezing regardless of surface temperature. The implications formed slowly. Earth below the frost line stayed approximately 50 to 55 degrees throughout winter. That was cold by human standards, but far warmer than the negative temperatures outside. A wall in contact with that earth would never drop below 50 degrees. A wall exposed to negative 20 air would drop toward that temperature constantly. The difference was not trivial. The idea that would eventually save dozens of lives came to Cornelis not through systematic reasoning, but through childhood memory. His father, Hendrik van der Meer, had been a skilled brick mason in Rotterdam, working primarily on wealthy merchants' homes and municipal buildings. Young Cornelis had accompanied his father to job sites from age 8 until he left for America at 19. Most of those memories had faded into general impressions of sawdust and brick dust and the steady rhythm of skilled labor. But one memory surfaced with unusual clarity. During a February night, when Cornelis lay awake listening to wind howl around his cabin, he remembered a merchant's house his father had worked on when Cornelis was perhaps 11 years old. The home was unusual because the owner had insisted on heated floors in his study and drawing room, a luxury most considered absurdly expensive. Cornelis remembered watching workers install a system of brick channels beneath the floor, creating pathways for hot air to travel from a furnace in the cellar. The floor above those channels stayed warm enough that the merchant could walk barefoot in winter, his father had explained. Cornelis had thought it wasteful at the time. Heat rises, everyone knew that. Putting heat below the floor seemed backward. The heated air would simply rise through the floorboards and escape, making the system inefficient. But his father had explained the principle differently. The bricks absorbed heat and held it, radiating warmth slowly over many hours. The floor itself became a heat source, warming the room from below more efficiently than a fireplace could warm from the side. The merchant had confirmed this, telling Hendrik the system used half the coal of a conventional fireplace while providing superior comfort. That conversation had occurred 15 years ago, and Cornelis had not thought about it since. Now it returned with the force of revelation. What if a cabin floor could store heat instead of draining it? What if the ground beneath the cabin, instead of being a thermal enemy, could be converted into thermal mass that absorbed and released heat slowly? The frost line principle suggested Earth below a certain depth maintained steady temperature. Could that natural insulation be combined with deliberately stored heat to create something entirely different from standard cabin construction? The concept seemed impossible at first examination. Frontier trappers did not have access to brick furnaces, or the materials wealthy Dutch merchants could afford. But the principle might be adaptable. Stone was plentiful. Fire was already necessary. Air channels could be created without brick if one had patience and careful planning. The earth itself was free, surrounding every cabin site in unlimited quantity. Cornelis spent the rest of February sketching plans in charcoal on flat pieces of bark. He had no formal training in engineering or architecture, but his father's work had taught him basic principles of heat transfer, weight distribution, and material properties. He began to envision a cabin built not on top of the ground, but partially into it, using the Earth's natural insulation while creating a heat storage system beneath the floor. Spring arrived late in 1840, the snow finally melting in mid-April. Cornelis made the journey to St. Louis with his season's furs, traveling with a group of trappers headed to the rendezvous. The 3-week journey gave him time to refine his ideas and consider whether they were practical or simply the obsessive thoughts of a man who had spent too much winter alone. He sold his furs for a modest profit, then spent 2 weeks in St. Louis doing something no other trapper would have considered. He studied buildings. He visited construction sites, watching workers lay foundations and install floor joists. He examined stone cellars, noting how they maintained cool temperatures in summer without ice. He found a warehouse being built near the riverfront and spent 3 days observing the foundation work, asking the foreman questions about drainage, moisture barriers, and weight distribution. The foreman thought him strange, but answered readily. Most men did not care about the invisible parts of buildings. Cornelis cared about nothing else. He visited a Lutheran church that had recently installed a heating system in its basement. The sexton gave him a tour, explaining how hot air from a coal furnace rose through iron grates in the floor, warming the sanctuary above. Cornelis examined the system carefully, noting how the heat traveled through ducted pathways rather than open space. The principle was similar to what his father had described, adapted for a larger building. The sexton explained that the system provided more even heat than stoves or fireplaces while using less fuel because the entire floor acted as a radiating surface. These observations confirmed what Cornelis had theorized during the winter. Heat could be stored in mass. Stone and earth absorbed thermal energy and released it slowly. A properly designed system could capture heat from a fire, transfer it to mass that would hold it for hours, and distribute that warmth through radiation rather than convection. The challenge was adapting these principles to frontier construction using only materials and tools a single man could manage. Cornelis returned to Minnesota Territory in June with supplies that made other trappers shake their heads. He had purchased neither luxuries nor standard trapping equipment. Instead, he carried a heavy iron grate, several iron bars of the type used for reinforcing masonry, a specialized chisel for splitting stone, and 3 hardcover books on building construction that had cost him a month's worth of fur profits. Isak Thorvaldsson, seeing the books, made a joke that spread through the scattered trapping camps. The Dutchman had gone soft, choosing reading over trapping, buying knowledge instead of whiskey. The joke would persist for months. Cornelis selected his building site in early July 1840, choosing a spot that made other trappers question his judgment entirely. Most men built near water for convenience, positioning cabins on flat ground with easy access to streams or rivers. Cornelis chose a hillside 200 yards from the creek, a location that would require hauling every bucket of water uphill. The site offered no obvious advantages. The slope was gentle but noticeable, the soil was rocky, and several large trees would need clearing. Peter Halverson, passing through on his way to check trap lines, stopped to ask if Cornelis had lost his mind. Cornelis explained his reasoning plainly. The hillside provided natural drainage, eliminating the risk of spring flooding that plagued low-lying cabins. The elevation offered clear sight lines in 3 directions, allowing him to see approaching threats whether animal or human. Most importantly, the slope would allow him to build into the earth itself, using the hill's mass as insulation. Peter listened to this explanation and shook his head. Building into a hillside meant fighting the earth instead of working with it. The moisture would rot the logs within 2 years. The whole plan was madness born from spending too much time alone. He wished Cornelius luck and continued on his way. Cornelius began digging the day after Peter left. He started not by cutting logs or preparing timber, but by excavating earth. Using a shovel, a pick, and a pry bar for loosening rocks, he dug into the hillside where his cabin would stand. The excavation was not a simple rectangle, but a carefully measured space 5 feet deep at the back, sloping to 3 feet deep at the front. The dimensions matched what would become the cabin's interior, 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep. Other trappers passing by saw him working in this hole and made jokes. Mikael Virtanen, whose own cabin stood a half-mile away, stopped one afternoon and asked if Cornelius was digging his own grave or building a root cellar. When Cornelius explained he was preparing the foundation for his cabin, Mikael laughed openly. Foundation work was for brick buildings in cities, not frontier cabins. The excavation took 3 weeks of steady labor. Cornelius removed not just soil, but carefully sorted what he dug. Topsoil he piled separately from subsoil. Large rocks he set aside for later use. The work was exhausting in summer heat, and progress came slowly. By early August, he had created a rectangular pit carved into the hillside, exposing earth that had not seen daylight in centuries. The bottom of the excavation was not level, but terraced, with the deepest section at the rear, where the hillside rose highest. Once the excavation was complete, Cornelius began the work that would define his entire approach. He did not start building walls. Instead, he spent the next 3 weeks installing what no frontier cabin had ever included, a deliberate foundation system designed to store and distribute heat. He laid flat stones across the excavation floor in careful patterns, creating channels between them. The stones Cornelius selected were not random. He spent 4 days gathering flat limestone pieces from a rocky outcrop half a mile from his building site. Each stone needed to meet specific criteria: relatively flat on both faces, between 2 and 4 inches thick, and large enough that 3 or 4 would cover a square foot of area. He rejected any stone that was cracked or layered in ways that suggested it might split under temperature changes. The selection process was tedious, but Cornelius understood that the entire system depended on stone that could absorb and hold heat without failing. He laid the first course of stones directly on the packed earth at the bottom of his excavation. These bottom stones formed channels running the length of the cabin from front to back, spaced approximately 8 inches apart. The channels were not uniform tubes, but rather gaps between parallel rows of stones, creating pathways for air to move beneath the floor. The pattern resembled a grid, with main channels running lengthwise and smaller connecting channels running across the width every 3 feet. Over this first course, Cornelius laid a second layer of stones, offsetting them so the joints did not align. This created a more stable structure and ensured that the channels remained open rather than being blocked by stone-to-stone contact. The second layer added thermal mass, giving more stone surface area to absorb heat. In the area where his fireplace would sit, he left a larger opening, creating a collection chamber where hot air from the fire could enter the channel system. The precision required was unlike anything standard cabin building demanded. Each stone needed to be positioned so it rested firmly on the stones below without rocking or tilting. Gaps needed to remain consistent to allow airflow. The entire surface needed to slope slightly toward the front of the cabin to prevent water accumulation if moisture ever entered the system. Cornelius used a plumb line and a level he had brought from St. Louis, tools most trappers would consider unnecessary affectation. Rasmus Jurgensen visited the site in mid-August and spent an hour examining what Cornelius had built. He walked across the stone floor, testing its stability, peering into the channels, trying to understand the purpose. Finally, he asked the obvious question. Why build all this beneath a floor no one would see? Why spend weeks arranging rocks when logs needed cutting and walls needed raising? Cornelis explained the principle as simply as he could. The stones would absorb heat from the fire and hold it for hours after the flames died. The floor above would stay warm, radiating heat upward into the living space. The cabin would require far less wood to maintain comfortable temperature. Rasmus listened to this explanation with visible skepticism. Heat rises, he pointed out, which everyone knows. Putting heat in the floor was fighting nature. The heat would simply rise through the floorboards and be wasted. And even if the stones held heat, as Cornelis claimed, that heat would be pulled downward into the cold earth below, lost to the ground. Cornelis began log construction in September, but not in the way any neighboring trapper had built. He cut logs from standing dead pine, selecting trees that had died within the past 2 years. Dead wood was drier and lighter than green timber, easier to work and less prone to checking as it seasoned. He cut each log to precise length, 17 feet for the front and back walls, 15 feet for the sides. Most trappers cut logs roughly and trimmed them during construction. Cornelis measured twice and cut once, understanding that precision now would mean better fitting later. He stripped every log completely, removing all bark using a draw knife he had brought from St. Louis. The work was tedious, each log requiring 2 to 3 hours of steady effort. Bark held moisture, and insects created irregular surfaces and would eventually decay and pull away from the wood. Stripped logs could be fitted more tightly and would last decades longer. Rasmus, visiting again in late September, watched Cornelis stripping bark and declared it a waste of effort. Bark provided extra insulation and helped seal gaps. Removing it was foolish refinement that served no practical purpose. But the real controversy began when Cornelis started positioning the walls. He did not build his cabin standing free on level ground. Instead, he set the first course of logs into the excavation he had spent weeks creating, positioning 3 walls directly against the earth of the hillside. The back wall sat deepest, embedded 5 feet into the slope. The side walls angled slightly, following the excavation's contours. Only the front wall stood fully exposed to air, and even it sat partially below grade, with its bottom logs resting on stone foundation. Before setting logs against earth, Cornelis installed a moisture barrier of birch bark, laying sheets of it against the excavated earth walls. Over this, he spread a thick layer of pine pitch he had rendered from sap, creating a waterproof membrane. Then he positioned his logs against this barrier, effectively entombing 3 walls of his cabin inside the hillside. The technique contradicted every principle of frontier building. Wood needed air circulation to prevent rot. Earth contact would wick moisture into the logs. The structure would be damp, moldy, and would decay within 5 years. Mikkel Virtanen brought his wife to see the construction in early October, presenting it as an example of what happens when educated thinking replaces common sense. "Look," he told her, "the Dutchman has buried his walls like a dead man. 3 sides of the cabin would never see sunlight. The earth would press against the logs constantly, forcing moisture through any gap. Come spring, the interior would be growing mushrooms." His wife asked Cornelis directly why he was building this way. Cornelis explained patiently that earth below frost line maintained steady temperature, neither freezing cold nor requiring heat. By late October 1840, Cornelis had completed his cabin's basic structure, and the result looked nothing like what trappers in Minnesota Territory considered proper construction. The building sat half swallowed by the hillside, with only its front wall fully visible and 3 sides buried under earth that Cornelis had carefully packed against the exterior logs. The roof was conventional wooden planking rather than the sod covering some had expected, but even this choice drew criticism. Niels Christensen argued that a sod roof would provide better insulation and fire protection. Cornelis countered that wood allowed him to maintain proper pitch for drainage and reduced the structural weight his walls needed to support. The interior dimensions were modest, 14 feet wide and 16 feet deep, creating 224 square feet of living space. Standard proportions by frontier measures, but the details revealed Cornelis's obsessive approach to thermal efficiency. The floor consisted of thick pine planks fitted so tightly that light could not pass between them, installed over the stone thermal mass system he had spent weeks constructing. The floorboards were not nailed in the usual manner, but set into notched joists, allowing them to be removed if he ever needed to access the stone channels beneath. The fireplace occupied the rear corner, built from stone gathered from the same outcrop that had provided his floor mass. But the firebox was unusually small, barely large enough to burn 3 logs simultaneously. Petter Halverson, examining it in early November, declared it inadequate for winter heating. A proper fireplace needed capacity to burn large loads of wood continuously. This small firebox would require constant feeding and would never produce sufficient heat. Cornelis explained that the fireplace was not intended to heat the cabin directly. Its purpose was to heat the stone mass beneath the floor. Small, efficient fires maintained over time would prove more effective than large, wasteful fires burning continuously. The chimney included a feature Cornelis had copied from buildings he had studied in St. Louis, a damper system that allowed him to control airflow precisely. By adjusting the damper, he could slow combustion, making fires burn longer on less wood while directing more heat into the thermal mass system rather than up the chimney. Most trappers had never seen an adjustable damper and considered it unnecessary complexity. Fire either burned or it did not. Trying to control it with mechanical devices was city thinking that had no place in wilderness construction. The door was solid pine planks, 3 inches thick and reinforced with iron straps. Cornelis had fabricated himself using the iron bars he had purchased in St. Louis. The hinges were massive, mortised into both door and frame in ways that made removal nearly impossible. A wooden bar secured the door from inside, but Cornelis had added a secondary locking beam that slid horizontally through iron brackets, connecting the door directly to the adjacent wall log. The security was excessive by frontier standards. Most trappers used simple wooden latches. Windows were positioned only on the front wall, small openings covered with oiled paper during construction, but fitted with wooden shutters that could be barred from inside. Cornelis had installed no windows on the buried walls, accepting reduced light in exchange for better thermal retention. Cornelis moved into his completed cabin on November 3, 1840, carrying the supplies and equipment he had stored in a temporary shelter during construction. The interior was dark due to the small windows and earth-backed walls, but he had anticipated this and installed 3 oil lamp brackets at strategic positions. The space felt different from standard cabins, not just cooler or darker, but somehow more substantial, as though the earth surrounding 3 walls provided weight and permanence that freestanding structures lacked. The air smelled of pine pitch, fresh-cut wood, and the mineral scent of stone. He built his first fire that evening, a small structure of kindling and 3 split logs arranged to burn slowly. The fire caught easily, flames rising in the small firebox and drawing well through the chimney. Cornelis adjusted the damper to slow the draft, extending burn time and directing more heat downward rather than up. He could feel warmth radiating from the firebox, but the real test would take hours. The stone mass beneath his feet needed time to absorb thermal energy before it could begin radiating heat back into the living space. He spent the evening arranging his supplies and equipment, establishing the organization that would define his daily routine. Sleeping platform against the front wall where windows would provide morning light. Food storage along the side wall where earth contact would keep temperatures cool and stable. Working space near the fireplace where he could process furs and repair equipment. Every few hours he added 2 logs to the fire, maintaining steady combustion rather than letting flames die and restarting from coals. By midnight, the floor near the fireplace had grown noticeably warm. Cornelius removed his boots and stood on the pine planks in wool socks. The wood felt warm against his feet, not hot, but distinctly above room temperature. He walked across the cabin, noting how warmth decreased with distance from the fireplace, but remained present even at the far front corner. The stone mass was beginning to function as he had theorized, absorbing heat and radiating it upward through the floorboards. He let the fire burn down to coals around 2 in the morning, adding no new wood. This was the critical test. Would the stored heat in the stone mass continue warming the cabin after the flames died, or would the interior temperature drop rapidly as it did in standard cabins? He wrapped himself in a blanket on his sleeping platform and dozed, waking periodically to check the thermometer hanging on the wall near the door. At 4 in the morning, with no fire burning for 2 hours, the interior temperature read 64 degrees. Outside temperature, measured by a second thermometer he had mounted on the exterior front wall, was 38 degrees. The cabin was maintaining a 26-degree differential with no active heat source. At 6 he rose, walked across the floor in bare feet, and found the wood still warm enough to be comfortable. The stone mass had retained the previous evening's heat and was releasing it slowly. December 1840 brought the first serious cold to Minnesota territory, with temperatures dropping into the teens at night and barely rising above freezing during daylight hours. Across the scattered farm trapping camps, men adjusted their routines to accommodate winter's demands. Fires needed constant attention. Wood consumption increased dramatically. The simple tasks of daily life became more difficult when performed in cabins that struggled to maintain 50 degrees. This was normal frontier winter, accepted as the price of living beyond civilization's comforts. Cornelius maintained his cabin with a routine that would have seemed absurdly minimal to his neighbors. He built a fire each morning around dawn, using 4 to 5 split logs arranged for slow combustion. The fire burned for 3 to 4 hours, heating the stone mass beneath his floor while providing enough warmth for cooking and melting snow for water. Around mid-morning, he let the fire burn down to coals, adding no new wood. The cabin's temperature would drop slightly over the next hours, but remained comfortable, sustained by heat radiating from the floor. In late afternoon, he built a second fire, slightly larger than the morning fire, burning 6 logs over 4 hours. This evening, fire recharged the thermal mass for the night ahead, ensuring the floor would radiate heat through the dark hours when exterior temperatures dropped to their lowest. By 10 at night, he would let this fire die as well, trusting the stored heat to maintain interior comfort until dawn. The results were remarkable by frontier standards. Interior temperature remained between 65 and 70 degrees throughout the day and night cycle. The floor stayed warm enough to walk barefoot comfortably. The air felt stable rather than cycling between overheated, near the fire, and frigid in corners. Cornelius was using approximately 1/3 the firewood that standard cabins required, and achieving superior comfort with that reduced consumption. Mikael Virtanen visited in mid-December, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but clearly curious about how the buried cabin performed in real cold. He stepped inside and immediately noticed the warmth. His own cabin, he admitted, was struggling to maintain 55 degrees despite fires that consumed a quarter cord of wood daily. Cornelius's interior felt at least 10 degrees warmer, and the fire was barely more than coals. Mikael walked across the floor, feeling the warmth through his boots. He asked how this was possible. Cornelius explained the thermal mass principle again. Stone beneath the floor absorbed heat from fires and released it slowly over 12 to 16 hours. The earth-bermed walls prevented heat loss that plagued standard construction. Mikael remained skeptical. The system might work in moderate cold, he said, but wait until January when temperatures truly plunged. Wait until the deep cold that killed Jakub Kowalski. January 1841 arrived with the kind of cold that tested every structure and every man in Minnesota territory. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees on January 9th and stayed below zero for 6 consecutive days. This was not the killing cold that would come the following year, but it was serious enough to separate adequate preparation from inadequate. Trappers who had cut insufficient firewood found themselves rationing fuel. Cabins built hastily with poor chinking became barely habitable. Men who had dismissed winter preparation as unnecessary learned otherwise. Cornelis's cabin faced this cold with the same quiet efficiency it had shown during December's moderate temperatures. His morning and evening fire routine remained unchanged. 4 logs at dawn, 6 logs at dusk, each fire burning 3 to 4 hours before being allowed to die to coals. The stone mass beneath his floor absorbed the heat from these fires and radiated it steadily through the intervening hours. Interior temperature dropped slightly during the coldest part of night, reaching a low of 62 degrees around 4 in the morning, but recovered quickly once he rebuilt the morning fire. The cabin's performance during this cold snap was notable not for dramatic results, but for consistency. While neighboring trappers increased their wood consumption by 50% or more to combat the deeper cold, Cornelis increased his by perhaps 20%, adding 1 or 2 extra logs to his evening fire. The thermal mass system proved its value not through spectacular efficiency, but through steady, predictable operation. The floor remained warm, the air remained comfortable. The wood consumption remained manageable. Peter Halverson visited on January 14th, the coldest day of that particular cold snap. Outside temperature was -18 degrees with wind that pushed the effective temperature even lower. Peter's own cabin was consuming wood at a rate that worried him, and he had 6 weeks of winter still ahead. He found Cornelis sitting at his small table, working on a pair of snowshoes, wearing a single wool shirt, rather than the multiple layers men typically needed indoors during deep cold. Peter sat near the fireplace, where coals glowed, but no active flames burned. The fire had been out for 3 hours, Cornelis explained. He would rebuild it around 5 in the afternoon for the evening heating cycle. Yet the cabin felt comfortable, perhaps 65 degrees, warm enough that Peter removed his heavy coat. He placed his hand on the floor and felt warmth radiating through the pine planks. The heat was gentle but persistent, nothing like the intense but localized warmth a fireplace produced. How much wood, Peter asked, did Cornelis burn in a day during this cold? Approximately 12 to 14 split logs, Cornelis estimated, depending on their size and how dry they were. Peter was burning 40 to 50 logs daily in his cabin and barely maintaining 50 degrees. The mathematics were undeniable. Cornelis was achieving better results with 1/3 the fuel consumption. Peter asked the question that was beginning to circulate among the scattered trapping community. Could this system be replicated? Could other men build cabins using Cornelis's approach, or did it require skills and knowledge most trappers lacked? Cornelis assured him the construction was straightforward for anyone with basic carpentry skills and patience. The stone mass required time to install, but no special expertise. The earth berming was simply excavation and backfilling. The principles were sound and could be adapted to different sites and conditions. The winter of 1841 passed without catastrophe for Cornelis. His cabin performed exactly as he had designed it to perform, maintaining comfort with minimal fuel consumption through January, February, and into March. But the real validation of his approach would not come until the following year, when cold arrived with a severity that frontier veterans would discuss for decades afterward. January 1842 brought temperatures that killed livestock, froze water in covered wells, and turned poorly built cabins into death traps for families who could not keep fires burning continuously. The cold began on January 4th and deepened steadily over the following week. By January 10th, the temperature had dropped to -25 degrees. By January 15th, it reached -32. And there it stayed, fluctuating between -30 and -40 for 12 consecutive days. Wind accompanied the cold, driving wind that found every gap in cabin walls and stole heat with relentless efficiency. Men who had lived in Minnesota territory for a decade said they had never experienced cold like this. Some compared it to stories their fathers told of winters in Scandinavia that killed hundreds. Standard cabin construction failed comprehensively under these conditions. The physics were simple and brutal. A cabin built with notched corners, mud chinking, and conventional log stacking lost heat through every surface faster than any reasonable fire could replace it. Families burned wood continuously, feeding fires every 2 hours throughout day and night, and still watched interior temperatures drop into the 40s. Frost formed on the inside of walls. Water buckets froze overnight, despite being kept near fires. Children slept in all their clothing under piles of furs and still woke shivering. Mikko Virtanen's cabin became a test case in survival. His structure was typical of frontier construction, adequate for normal winters, barely sufficient for hard winters, and dangerously inadequate for extreme cold. He and his wife fed their fire every 2 hours for the first week of the cold snap, burning through wood reserves at a catastrophic rate. By day 9, they were rationing fuel, letting the fire burn lower between feedings, accepting interior temperatures in the low 50s. By day 11, they were burning furniture and tool handles to supplement their dwindling wood supply. His wife mentioned Cornelis's cabin on the morning of day 12. The Dutchman's chimney showed smoke only twice daily, thin streams that lasted a few hours. Yet his windows glowed with steady light every evening, suggesting warmth and comfort rather than desperate survival. Perhaps, she suggested quietly, they should ask for shelter if their wood ran out before the cold broke. Mikhail refused initially. Pride prevented asking for help, especially from a man whose unconventional methods he had openly mocked. But as day 12 became day 13 and their wood pile shrank to a supply that might last 3 more days, pride became a luxury they could not afford. On the evening of January 17th, with exterior temperature at -37 degrees and his cabin interior at 48 degrees, despite a roaring fire, Mikhail made his decision. Mikhail walked to Cornelis's cabin through darkness so cold that breathing hurt and exposed skin numbed in seconds. The 200 yards between structures felt like miles. Wind cut through his heavy coat and wool layers as though they were paper. His hands ached inside thick mittens. His feet, wrapped in fur-lined boots, began losing sensation before he was halfway across the distance. This was cold that could kill a man in minutes if he stopped moving or lost his way. This was cold that made survival itself an accomplishment. He knocked on Cornelis's door and waited, stamping his feet to maintain circulation. The door opened, releasing a wave of warmth that felt shocking after the exterior cold. Cornelis stood in the doorway wearing wool trousers and a simple cotton shirt, dressed as though it were a mild autumn evening rather than the depths of winter's worst assault. Behind him, the cabin interior glowed with lamplight, comfortable and inviting. Mikhail could see no fire burning in the small fireplace, only the faint glow of banked coals. Cornelis invited him inside immediately, reading the situation in Mikhail's face and posture. Mikhail entered and felt warmth envelop him like a physical thing. The cabin was not merely warm, but comfortably so, perhaps 70 degrees, a temperature that seemed impossible given the exterior conditions. He removed his mittens and felt the air on his bare hands without the usual shock of cold that even indoor air carried during deep winter. His face, numb from the walk, began tingling as sensation returned. Cornelis closed the door and secured it with his elaborate locking system. He offered Mikhail a seat near the fireplace, though heat was not concentrated there as it would be in a standard cabin. The entire space felt uniformly warm, as though heat came from everywhere rather than from a single source. Mikhail sat and felt warmth through his boots. The floor was radiating heat upward, just as Cornelis had claimed it would. The sensation was unusual, but deeply comforting, like sitting on sun-warmed stone in summer. Mikkel explained his situation directly. His wood would last perhaps 3 more days at current consumption rates. His family was cold, despite burning everything burnable. If the temperature did not rise soon, they would face a choice between freezing in their cabin or attempting the dangerous journey to Fort Snelling for shelter. Could Cornelis provide temporary refuge if the worst happened? He asked the question with difficulty, pride warring with necessity. Cornelis responded without hesitation. Michael's family was welcome here for as long as needed. The cabin could accommodate 5 people, though space would be tight. More importantly, Cornelis wanted Mikhail to understand why this cabin could shelter them when Mikhail's could not. He walked Mikhail through the construction principles, explaining the thermal mass system, the earth berming, the insulation properties of soil below the frost line. He showed Mikhail the stone floor beneath the pine planks, lifting one board to reveal the channel system. He explained the twice-daily firing schedule and the mathematics of heat storage versus heat loss. Mikhail listened with the attention of a man whose survival might depend on understanding these principles. His skepticism, maintained for 18 months, dissolved in the face of physical evidence. Mikhail returned to his own cabin that night with new understanding, but no immediate solution. His structure could not be rebuilt during winter, and his wood supply continued its steady decline toward exhaustion. 2 days later, on January 19th, he made the decision his pride had resisted. He loaded his wife and 2 children onto a small sled, gathered essential supplies, and made the short but brutal journey to Cornelis's cabin. The temperature that morning was -39 degrees. Cornelis welcomed them without comment on the circumstances that brought them. He helped carry the children inside, both wrapped in so many layers they could barely move. Mikhail's wife was shivering violently despite heavy furs. The family had been living in temperatures barely above freezing for days, their bodies depleted by constant cold stress. The warmth of Cornelis's cabin hit them like a physical force. The children stopped crying almost immediately. Mikhail's wife sank onto a bench and simply sat, absorbing heat, too exhausted for conversation. The cabin that had seemed adequately sized for 1 person felt crowded with 5, but the warmth made the crowding tolerable. Cornelis organized sleeping arrangements efficiently. The adults would share the sleeping platform in shifts. The children could sleep near the fireplace where residual warmth was strongest. He prepared hot food, melting snow for water, and cooking a simple stew. The act of eating warm food in a warm space restored the family visibly. Color returned to faces. Shivering subsided. Normal conversation became possible. That evening, Mikhail walked the perimeter of the interior, examining details he had dismissed during previous visits. He felt the warmth radiating from the floor throughout the space. He noted the absence of frost on any interior surface. He observed how little wood Cornelis used for the evening fire compared to the massive consumption his own cabin required. The contrast was undeniable. This structure worked in ways standard construction could not match. Over the following 3 days, while exterior temperatures remained below -30, Mikhail studied Cornelis's methods with the focus of a man preparing to replicate them. He examined the stone mass system when Cornelis lifted floor planks to show the channel layout. He asked detailed questions about excavation depth, stone selection, moisture barriers, and thermal principles. Cornelis answered everything openly, sketching diagrams in ash on the hearthstones, explaining the physics in practical terms rather than theoretical language. The children adapted quickly to the warmth, playing on the floor in light clothing, their bodies recovering from days of cold stress. Mikhail's wife helped with daily tasks, grateful for shelter but also observing how the cabin functioned. She noticed that laundry dried overnight hung near the ceiling. She noted that water buckets never froze. She saw that Cornelis walked barefoot, comfortably, something impossible in their own cabin even during moderate winter. On January 22nd, the temperature finally rose above zero. By January 24th, it had climbed to 15 degrees, cold but manageable. Mikhail's family prepared to return to their own cabin, their wood supply barely sufficient to last. Until spring if used carefully. But Mikhail made Cornelis a promise before leaving. Spring 1842 arrived late, snow persisting into mid-April and ground remaining frozen until early May. But when conditions finally allowed construction, Mikhail began building a new cabin using principles Cornelis had demonstrated. He selected a hillside site similar to Cornelis's location, began with excavation rather than log cutting, and spent weeks installing a stone thermal mass system before raising walls. Neighbors watched this process with the same skepticism they had shown Cornelis, but Mikhail worked steadily, following the design that had saved his family. Cornelis helped with technical aspects that required two men or specialized knowledge. He assisted with stone channel layout, advised on moisture barrier installation, and explained chimney construction for optimal draft control. The new cabin took all summer to complete, far longer than standard construction, but by October, Mikhail had a structure built partially into earth with thermal mass heating beneath its floor. When winter arrived, his family experienced comfort they had never known in frontier life. Word spread through Minnesota Territory's scattered settlements over the following years. The technique acquired various names: earth cabins, hillside houses, the Dutch method. Some trappers adopted it fully, replicating Cornelis's design with minor adaptations for different sites. Others incorporated partial elements, adding earth berming to existing structures or installing simplified thermal mass systems. The approach never became universal because the time and labor requirements exceeded what many were willing to invest. But for those who committed to the method, the results justified the effort. By 1845, 17 earth-sheltered cabins existed within a day's travel of Cornelis's original structure. Each variation reflected its builder's circumstances and understanding, but all shared core principles: excavation into hillsides, thermal mass beneath floors, earth insulation around walls, and small, efficient fires replacing large, wasteful ones. Winter wood consumption in these structures averaged 1/4 to 1/3 of standard cabin requirements while providing superior comfort. The technique spread beyond Minnesota as settlers moved westward. Homesteaders discovering abandoned hillside cabins recognized their advantages and built similar structures. The method proved particularly valuable in regions with extreme temperature swings, where Earth's thermal stability moderated both winter cold and summer heat. Accounts from the 1850s and 60s include references to earth-sheltered homes that required minimal heating fuel and maintained comfortable temperatures year-round. Cornelis himself built no more cabins after his original structure. He married in 1846, moved to a small farm near Fort Snelling, and lived quietly away from frontier life. He raised 3 children, farmed modest acreage, and worked occasionally as a carpenter on conventional buildings. He died in 1867 at age 53, buried in a cemetery that no longer exists. His gravestone made no mention of the cabin that had changed frontier building practices, but in the hills of Minnesota and beyond, structures built using his principles continued functioning decades after standard cabins had rotted or collapsed. Some remained occupied into the 1890s. A few survived into the 20th century. The innovation was never dramatic enough for history books, never revolutionary enough for fame. It simply worked, quietly and persistently, keeping people warm through winters that killed those in conventional shelters. The legacy was measured not in recognition, but in survival, carved into hillsides across the frontier, built from earth and stone, and understanding that warmth comes not from fighting nature, but from working with principles nature provides freely to those patient enough to learn them.